A not so funny thing happened in 1969 during my mad dash to become a grown-up. That something horrified me and gratified me. But most importantly, it taught me that mothers are neither the monsters nor the invincible sheroes we so often make them out to be. And no matter what happened after that year, I would never view Mama or her life-controlling household rules the same. Ethel Kearney's rules. Whether it was actually her rules, adolescent hormones in play, or my anxiety to be viewed as an adult, Mom and I often found ourselves in a silent, but caustic tug of war. Whatever that strange composite, I was that young girl trying as hard as I could to convince myself that my hate for my mama's rules could actually nullify my love for her. If I'd written out Mama's rules on my lined notebook paper, the pages would have stretched from the farthest wall of our family outhouse to the front wall of our living room, where our 12-inch black and white television sat, and where the Kearney children spent 1 hour on Sundays watching Marlon Perkins' Wild Kingdom, and weeknights mesmerized by T.J. Kearney's amazing tales, before being shooed off to do homework. Mama practiced the one lesson, one rule kind of parenting. She only told you once, but fully expected that one lesson to stick forever, or at least until you no longer lived in the Kearney household. If she ever had to tell you any one thing a second time, just take my word for it, you did not want to be a slow learner in the Kearney household. But the craw that stuck in this 15-year-old's throat, however, was not simply that Mama's rules were archaic. Cleopatra's mother surely delivered the same eggs to her child some 2,000 years ago. But the unapologetically unfairness in the way she parsed out her rules to her 11 boys and 8 girls. Nowhere near a brilliant child, I early on sensed the imbalance in Mama's arc of justice. Such brazen inequality right there in our own home. If there was any one thing that brought out this young girl's feminist side, it was my mother's rules that favored her boys. No rules about dating or staying out late or spending the night with friends if you were a young male in the Kearney household. I only half joke now that my first date came after I graduated from high school, and the boy who liked me was allocated 2 hours to visit me on Sunday nights before the 10 o'clock news. While I wasn't clear about what feminism meant at the time, I knew what it protested against. A sense of being shortchanged on life simply because of your anatomy. Admittedly, no one who knew me thought I even remotely reminded them of a young Shirley Chisholm or Fannie Lou Hamer, and certainly not Angela Davis, given the fact that my parents refused to let us style our hair in that beautiful, perfectly rounded Afro style. Nevertheless, if I could have, without fear of retribution, I would have expressed my deep sense of injustice. So, like so many other terrified young women, especially those with mothers who didn't believe in sparing the rod, I became a genius at manipulation. The definitive young manipulative feminist. I will even be forthcoming these 40 years later and admit that I was a two-faced child. Cowardly. Good on the outside and full of manipulative thoughts on the inside. Never, ever would I have openly protested my mother's rules. I am still, in fact, remembered by neighbors as one of Miss Ethel's good girls who never gave her much trouble. And I was, if that meant a child who methodically followed Mama's rules as long as she was watching. The thin, Once I was out of her sight and she was out of listening range, I let my rage soar. I learned and remembered every curse word I ever heard. To use them when normal verbiage didn't serve my purpose. I could roll my eyes with the rest of them, behind Mama's back, of course. And one of my proudest forms of protest was going sometimes days without speaking one syllable to a living soul. Not that I wouldn't follow every one of Mama's directives on those days. I just wouldn't affirm it. Okay, that didn't faze Mama one bit. I mean, she had a passel of children who talked and argued and fought inside and outside the house from morning till night. One 15-year-old who actually kept her mouth shut 90% of the time. Such a protest flew right over Mama's pragmatic, no-nonsense head. The thing is, subtlety works in some households. Not in homes with 10 or more children with loud mouths. Then one day, in the midst of this one-sided tug-of-war with my mother, life changed. I woke up a child that morning, but by nighttime I was virtually a grown-up, with knowledge that only a grown-up should ever have. Suddenly, Mama was far more important than her rules, and was far from invincible. She wouldn't live forever. And really, never had her life really revolved around confounding mine and my siblings' lives by dishing out those rules. I had been the blind and self-absorbed one, defining Ethel Kearney by her mastery at rule-making and dispensation, defining myself by my level of manipulative acumen. That day will always be remembered by the balloon word that floated above me, cancer. There's no doubt that I'd heard the word before, but why would I have kept it for future reference? It wasn't until that fall day that I learned how Mama was, how human Mama was, that I was forced to embrace it, like an uninvited member of my family. And as I did with most words, I needed to roll it around in my mouth like a smooth cat-eye marble before I could truly absorb it. What was this strange intruder? It was 1969, and no one had explained what cancer was. I had no recollection of one living soul using the word in my presence. Not the news commentator on our black and white television, not my high school teachers, and certainly not our minister at Lincoln Chapel Church. 15-year-olds are notorious for lying to themselves about how smart and grown up they are. Back then, if anyone had dared question my maturity, I'd have fixed them with one of those Betty Davis or Greta Garbo stares that I'd swiped from some evening matinee. You know that stare that says, "You're obviously too blind or too much of a fool to see how amazingly smart and sophisticated I am." Imagining at 15 that I was far smarter and more than a duck than I really was one thing. But there was something else. I was ashamed of how much I loved and admired my mother, something I would never in a million years have admitted. In my eyes, Ethel Kearney was not just bigger than the world, she was the world. The Clint Eastwood of the Kearney household, a woman who rarely spoke, and when she did, it was barely above a whisper. Yet she demanded an inordinate level of respect from not just my father, but from her whole brood of children and the community around her. In spite of how much others held Ethel Kearney in awe, I refused to reveal my own feelings. I kept them wrapped tightly inside me. And because I was naturally a quiet child, it wasn't hard to do. Not even my best friend, Linda, who was the first to learn I had kissed a boy, nor my sister Joanne, who was my best friend all of my life until our teenage years when she became my worst enemy. Certainly not my brothers who watched Joanne and me like hawks and swirled our large and small sins to Mama with glee. No, not a soul suspected that I worshiped the ground my mother walked on, or that there was absolutely nothing you could do short of threatening me with a slow and horrible death, or gouging my eyes out where I'd never read another book to force me into admitting it. But then came the cancer. I wanted to, but could find no palatable way to ask other girls in my class whether they had encountered this horrible disease. Somehow, I didn't believe they had. Instead, I was convinced this was a personal thing between God and me. He'd singled this young sinner out, striking the one most important person in my life, all because of my cowardly lies and pretenses in response to Mama's outrageous rules. I knew that the cancer wasn't about me, not the same way it was about Mama, yet it changed me in significant ways. I knew what I had to do: seek a truce with my mother, try for an honest relationship. Maybe, if I was lucky enough, forge a friendship, if such a thing was possible. Most importantly, I knew this was fair warning, that I must atone for the cowardly sins. I did, and God actually listened to my pitiful prayers. My apologies and promises late at night when I knew Joanne and Jeff and JD, who all shared my bedroom, were asleep, and I had God's ear all to myself. It was only during this time that I could open up about my fears for myself and for Mama. Only during those quiet hours between sleep and morning, that was the time I remembered with fresh pain how hurtful my quiet hate had been, even if Mama never knew it. As my younger siblings slept and dreamed of tomorrow, I was pining for a yesterday I couldn't change. A child wrapped in old sins, bargaining with God for redemption and grace, and most importantly, to spare my mother. He did listen. The most memorable sacrifice was one single breast that had been sustenance to all of her 18 children. From the son she bore at the age of 17 to her last child, Judy, born 2 months before her 47th birthday. Without understanding why I had been spared much, my atonement was a kind of rite of passage, one that hurried and authenticated my maturity. I served as my mother's caretaker through her next months of healing, spending the morning hours before I caught the yellow school bus, changing the dressing on her now flattened wound. I became my mother for that time, and nothing in this world could have made me understand my mother's value more than that odd reversal of roles. The cancer, or God, or maybe some strange collaboration forced me at 15 to push aside my childish grief and guilt, allowed me to actually grow up, not just play at being grown. I was no Joan of Arc or Sarah Bernhardt, yet I knew that moment explained so much that my 15-year-old self had been too blind to see. I spent the next 10 years learning so much more about my mother and myself. Magically, we forged that friendship I needed so desperately. I never stopped counting my blessings that she would forgive me without telling me why. I learned to admit my love for a woman I had refused to adore for so long. 10 years after her cancer first appeared, and several years after the kind doctor assured us it was in remission, we learned it was back, this time for good. That arrogant and wise rogue arrived far too early, but maybe not. There's a time for all things. I said goodbye days before the phone call came. As I sat beside her bed and she touched my hand and looked into my eyes and said, remember, remember, remember all. Even as we smiled across the hospital bed, our smiles mirrors of each other, I knew. I'll remember, Mama. she left an invaluable gift. Her lessons, her rules, I'll remember. Thank you.